I once had a friend who was a war hero. I'm not talking the Marvel superpowers sort of war hero. No CGI special effects or dramatic theme music swelling in the background. My friend, his name was Narven, though he mostly went by Chris, was a real war hero. The unsung type. And he was gay. But before we get to him, you need to understand a few things about me. When I was a kid, the rule was you lived outside. You only came indoors when you were called for dinner, and you were only called once. Those were the rules. Still, there were times when the rules were relaxed. Blizzards, bushfires, earthquakes, that sort of thing. And then you could stay inside. Confined to the bedroom I shared with my younger brother, but at least inside. If you were extra lucky, you got to watch TV. Daytime TV. For a kid, it was equal to drinking whiskey before noon. My brother preferred westerns. I wanted the Battle of Britain. Dam busters, RAF fighter pilots saving Western civilization from the Nazi menace. My father, a Royal Navy man, approved. He was not a man to be questioned when it came to matters of war, the Empire, and the natural supremacy of the British race. So there we sat in front of our 19-inch black and white television. Him with his Rothmans king-size filter-tip cigarettes, me with a mug of cocoa, soaking up the best of post-war British celluloid propaganda. Regaled by cinematic accounts of British heroism, British engineering ingenuity, and British military prowess. Now don't get me wrong, life wasn't all tea and crumpets. My fiercely loyal Australian mother did her best to compensate for the influence of the English rallies, but she couldn't compete with a good British war film. I was convinced all fighter pilots flew Spitfires and looked like David Niven. Bomber crews flew Lancaster bombers and consumed gallons of tea without ever needing a pit stop. Impervious to grief, they scanned the skies hoping for a sighting of a lost colleague or another crew who'd encountered a spot of bad luck. The Americans simply helped out. So back to Narven. All those ideas about war heroes were shattered when years later I met Chris. Chris was neither British nor of my generation. He was one of those Yanks who, despite turning up late, were the real saviours of Western civilization. I met Chris in Vancouver in August 1990. I had travelled to Vancouver with my boyfriend, Lewis, to compete in Gay Games 3. Chris was in town to enjoy the spectacle. My first recollection of Chris are the stories. He was a born storyteller. His favourites were outrageous, sometimes bordering on fantasy, but always spellbinding. When I was 6 years old, my grandma told me she married my grandpa because he had the biggest cock in Utah. Where do you go from that? Believe me, most of the others were far worse, and I was hooked. At the end of our trip, we visited Chris at his home in San Francisco. Dinner was excellent. His cooking was on a par with his storytelling, generous and heavily seasoned. 2 years passed before we met again. Lewis had died, and I was struggling to reimagine my life in his absence. So I did what so many before me had done. I fled to San Francisco, searching. Despite our age difference, we became friends. Over the following decade, I saw a lot of the Pacific Ocean from 30,000 feet. For a time, the Keystone Apartments on Hyde Street became a home away from home. I still only need to close my eyes to hear the rattling of the streetcars. Slowly, I found a future for myself, and slowly I began to unlock the conundrum that was Narven Christensen. Chris could be dazzling in his wit and unnervingly flirtatious. He'd been active in the emerging gay community in San Francisco during the 1960s and 1970s, and left exhausted by the AIDS crisis of the 1980s, but felt alienated from the youth-obsessed Castro Street scene of the 1990s. He was devoted to his Mormon family and feared for his immortal soul, but was hopelessly hedonistic. He desired the comfort of the American dream, but knew his kind were not welcome in that twisted utopia, no matter how hard they tried to pass the entrance test. He was a riddle of a man. As the years passed, I learned the key to understanding Chris was this. He'd been a ball turret gunner in World War II. Chris grew up on a farm in Utah. He could ride a horse before he could read a book. His life was defined by the herd and the seasons. But all that changed when the war in Europe reached out to America. In 1943, at the tender age of 18, he enlisted in the US Army Air Force. He was posted to RAF Basingbourn, where he served with the 91st Bomb Group as a ball turret gunner on a B-17 Flying Fortress aircraft. A ball turret is a metal and glass sphere attached to the belly of a bomber. It's been described as a death trap designed by a sadist. Chris was 6 feet tall. How he managed to fold himself into that contraption is a mystery to me. As a boy, the only thing he ever managed to squeeze into was a pair of cowboy boots. It's a miracle he survived. In 1943, a bomber crew's life expectancy was 11 missions. A ball turret gunner's was less than half that. It was the most dangerous job in the air. Against all the odds, he survived. Against even crazier odds, he met and fell in love with another young American airman, I'll call Jimmy. What a sight they must have been. A pair of corn-fed, blonde-haired, blue-eyed teenagers who couldn't keep their hands off each other. It sounds like the plot of a 1970s porn video. Did anyone notice? Apparently not, as they worked hard to keep their love a secret. Exposure would have guaranteed court-martial and disgrace. I want to be clear, theirs was not an any port in a storm passion in the cauldron of war. They dreamt of a life together, but fate was against them. Jimmy was killed in an air crash soon after the war ended. Chris was alone in his misery, but not alone in his predicament. He was one of countless young gay men who proudly served their country, but dared not speak the truth of their lives. Scarred from living under the constant threat of annihilation and the added threat of prosecution. The reward for their sacrifice? Erasure. Deliberate, systematic, cold-blooded erasure. Fags, after all, can't be brave. Queers can't be heroes. Like many others, Chris married after returning to civilian life. Most of those men endured a miserable existence, always fearful of exposure. Many never escaped that life or spoke the truth of their story. Some, like Chris, had the courage or good luck to escape to a city like San Francisco in the hope of finding like-minded survivors. Some even dared to hope for happiness. And some worked as the produce manager at the Marina Safeway for close to 20 years. Oh, the stories he could tell. Chris died many years ago. It's only now, as an older man, that I'm beginning to understand his feelings of disengagement from the gay pride movement that as a young man I embraced so eagerly. And I can now see how extraordinary my friendship with him was. Because who gets to say their friend was a war hero? For so long I didn't get it. Not until I read Luke Turner's Men at War, a book that tears up the tired old myths about masculinity and war. Turner spares no punches in arguing war is as much about desire as it is about guns and machines. And that's when I had to think again about men like Chris, about the trauma they experienced in the defence of our freedom and the scars they were forced to keep hidden. And so I ask myself, if I was the only person who knew someone like Chris, how would I tell his story to a generation of young queers who had no experience or memory of war or its shadows? I want my war heroes to be real people, not dusty relics from the past. I want my war heroes to step out of the black and white films of my childhood and live again in glorious, messy, living colour. So this is my attempt to tell their story. And yes, it's partly my story. All history is subjective. Look away if you're easily offended. But if you stay, listen and watch, and hopefully discover that real war heroes looked and lived a lot like you and me.